Welcome.
There we go.
I hope this finds everyone well. We're trying something a little bit different today. We're going to go on location. We're at Mr. Brew. And hold on, we're going to get Gabby set up to where she can watch us.
She can watch us and see what's happening here. We're hoping that the Wi-Fi cooperates here and that everyone gets a smooth presentation this week.
Right. That's our goal. That's our goal. But again, we're at Mr. Brew. It's on Milwaukee. It's a
just north of 82nd.
Yeah. Heather and I went to lunch here yesterday, and while I was sitting here, I thought,
that's right.
We just finished 69-cent Wild Wings, and so that was great. Man, and they were really good. So
excellent. So
I think we
2 thumbs up, right?
2 thumbs up. I think we might try this every Thursday. It's not a bad way to end a Thursday. But so we're on chapter 3 of the story, and we got locked. Gabby has. All right, where we go. So 3 of the story, it was all about Joseph. So hopefully you were able to read that. If you haven't, then you can use
Jump
this.
on into it. Yeah,
use this as a tool to kind of start that. So basically, it takes us from Genesis 32, 33-ish probably
37.
actually. Okay, 37. 37. So I knew 32 is when Jacob wrestles with
yes, exactly.
God, and so I know it's just kind of ended where we were.
Yep.
But so 37 in chapter 50, all the way through the end of Genesis, really, and so a number of chapters that are in there, but really one storyline. Whereas last week we kind of covered.
Man, there were a lot of different stories
really
going on.
So Abraham
in the entire Bible.
Absolutely.
I mean, when people talk about an in-depth story with lots of twists and turns, I mean, the story of Jacob is it.
Or Joseph,
not Jacob. Jacob has some too, but yes,
too.
Joseph. Yeah.
So, a couple things that jumped right out at me when we were reading it. One of the things that jumped out is it kind of skipped the very beginning of the story, which I thought was interesting. So
we don't have a lot of complaints about the book, but this is one where we were talking and we're like, this is kind of odd.
Right. So to kind of fill in the gap a little bit, we always talk about what was not in the story. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was not in there was all of Joseph's dreams, which kind of sets the stage of his brother's hatred towards them, towards Joseph. It sets the also prophetic scene of what's about to happen, what's gonna come.
Yeah.
But in particular, you know, the theme starts with the dream is mentioned, but the whole thing starts with Joseph has a dream, and in his dream, his brothers are bowing down to him and acting like as if he's king, and then Joseph, I'm going to call this youth. I would call it not the most intelligent thing that you would do when he goes and tells his dream to his brothers and says, hey, I had a dream and it was very vivid and y'all worshipped me. And
exactly. Well, and then he even tells it to his dad.
Right.
And remember, so there's the 2 parts of it, right? There's the sheaves that bow down to his sheaf, and that's his brothers bowing down to him. And I said sheaves, not sheep, okay? So it's sheaves of grain. And then you've got the one with the stars bowing down to his star, but also the sun and the moon, which implies that his mom and dad would bow towards him too.
Right.
Yeah.
So his brothers didn't really like this. It enraged what was already there in their jealousy.
And I mean, you lose that beginning of the story too, which is that I think there's a spot right away where it says that Joseph actually goes and tells on his brothers.
Yeah.
And we don't know what. We don't know what happened. It may have been very legitimate what he had to report to his father, but there's a number of points of tension that we can see early on in the relationship between Joseph and his brothers.
So then the story picks up with that tension having already been built.
Yes.
And so with the tension already built, they begin their plot to kill Joseph, and or at least I guess the plot did start to kill Joseph, and then it backed off from there. But it started with the extreme and back down to giving him away, which I thought was interesting.
If you even think of it as backing off, I mean, if you're asking me, would you rather just be killed or be sold? And again, if you know what's going to happen in the end of the story, maybe you're good with the in between. But if I'm told that I'm going to be sold off into a life of slavery, I might just wish it done. Yeah.
So, kind of interesting. One of the things that I've always known, but this is where I appreciate the story, is it kind of tied it all together. Who he was sold to was the Ishmaelites, which we just got finished talking about how the Ishmaelites even came to be with Abraham and Hagar, so that's who comes full circle. That's who Joseph was sold into slavery. We know that then the Ishmaelites go into Egypt. And And while they're in Egypt, that's when they sell Joseph again, and he is now a slave to the Egyptians. And
to a man named Potiphar, who's apparently a relatively significant figure in Egypt. Yeah,
pretty significant person. We know how the story goes. Long story short, hope you all read it. But while he's there, Potiphar's wife, and it says in the Bible that Joseph was a handsome, strong man. So Potiphar's wife took interest. Joseph turned her down on several occasions. After turning her down on several occasions, she finally calls him in and basically screams, you attacked me, you raped me, molested me, or advanced.
So she tries to. She basically goes from trying to entice him to saying,
to
hey,
accusing.
Well, she tries to force the issue,
right?
Not just well you, but you well,
right?
And then when he turns her down and runs away, she grabs the robe and kind of sets up the situation where she could accuse him of rape,
right? And so then he gets thrown in jail. That brings us to the next part of the whole story that is left out, and that's while he was in prison. You have the cupbearer and you have the baker that's there, and he interprets the dreams for the cupbearer and the baker, and it sets up the scene because those eventually go back to be under the Pharaoh's command and work. And
the cupbearer goes back, the baker gets offed.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The baker, he doesn't quite make it there. But
Joseph correctly interprets both dreams, that the cupbearer would be returned to service and the baker would
But the cupbearer gets access to the Pharaoh, and then when the Pharaoh has his dreams and needs his dreams interpreted, the cupbearer can say with certainty, I know a man who can interpret your dreams. And that's, long story short, that's how Joseph gets in with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's so gracious that he interpreted his dreams accurate, prepared all of Egypt for what was to come in the famines. And people, I think, love to underestimate how much power and authority Joseph really had while he was in Egypt.
Well, he gets given the signet ring from the Pharaoh, which is basically like saying, you are me wherever you are.
You get to act. So people say, Joseph was the vice Pharaoh. He really is more than that. And in fact, it says in the scriptures that Pharaoh would sit on the throne and hold the position, but Joseph got to do all the work with all the authority.
People think of it like you're the vice president, and we know vice president has very little power in our world. This is not
except the one we have now. She's got more. Nah, I'm not going there. Anyways,
I don't know how much. Yeah, anyways. But yes, he is essentially acting as Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is kind of like, I still have the title, I still have the position, but I trust you to do everything.
Exactly. So it's just kind of interesting how it sets up. And the other thing that's neat is it sets up what's coming up in the next chapter, because then after the whole scene with Joseph and his brothers.
So when the brothers come to get grain and he hides himself from them or doesn't reveal himself to be their brother. And people are always like, well, how would you not recognize your brother?
It's been a long time, and they thought he was
dead. It says that he spoke through a translator. That's one of those interesting little notes, is that he's obviously he could understand what his brothers say, but he uses a translator to kind of put a mask on there. People point out the fact that Egyptians would have dressed very differently, so he would have been shaven. He would have been, 13 years older too. More than that, I think. What his brother? So he's 17 when he's sold off into slavery, and I believe he's 39 when his brothers come. So think 22 years older.
Right, and the story ends with all of them bringing in Joseph, bringing in his family and everybody into Egypt, which sets a scene for Moses, because then some time passes. Everyone forgets about Joseph in Egypt, forgets about what he did, and there you just have these foreigners who are all residing in Egypt, and that sets them up for then slavery and the persecution that they take on. So it's kind of interesting. People often ask, how did the Hebrews, or how did they ever get to Egypt in the first place? Well, that's how they got there. It's through the story of Joseph.
So Egypt is a very interesting place when you examine it throughout Scripture. There's this theme of Egypt, and going to Egypt. And there's this tension between Egypt being good and bad at the same time. So when Abraham goes to Egypt the first time, it's because there's a famine in the land. Does that sound familiar? Okay, that'll be a theme. And he goes there, and that's when he kind of passes off Sarah as his sister instead, because he's afraid that he'll get killed. We talked about that in the study last week, right? And so then there's this continued. We go to Egypt to kind of get away and to try to find safety, but bad things eventually happen too. All right. Now the important thing is that when Joseph calls his family to Egypt, God actually gives Jacob permission to go to Egypt, as opposed to when Isaac goes without permission. That's, Jacob is actually kind of, I think it seems like almost torn when we're sitting there and reading about it. He goes to Beersheba, it says, which is kind of the edge of the promised land, and he sets up an altar and he's talking to God and worshiping, and God tells him, you can leave, which it has that nice little parallel to when Jacob had to leave the promised land the first time. And he's sitting there with a stone for the pillow or whatever, and God gives him the vision of the angels descending and ascending. He says, go ahead and go, but you're going to come back. And so then again, we have this story of going to Egypt and saying, that's all right, you can go, but I'm going to bring you back. But this time he tells them it's going to be a few hundred years before your family comes back.
Right.
But I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to bless them there. So Egypt is a place that's going to be full of tension and slavery, but it's also going to be a place where he blesses them and grows them into the people that he wants them to be.
Awesome. So, big picture take on what we went through today. What did you find?
So upper story, lower story here again, right?
Exactly. So explain upper story, lower story.
Yeah, so remember we're saying, there's the whole theme of God's salvation plan from the beginning of Scripture all the way to the end of it. And that's essentially, with this story, what we're seeing here is, upper story is going ahead and building up his people by bringing them to Egypt, and setting up the line that's going to lead all the way to Jesus. Even one of the stories that's skipped on that we didn't talk about, but we mentioned, we're like, should we talk about it? There's this chapter 38, if you read it.
Yeah, it's
Judah and Tamar. It's kind of a weird story.
Doesn't fit in with the rest of the narrative.
But the one part of it that fits in is the fact that Tamar is part of the line of Jesus. And so, in Luke's narrative, he's got all the kind of strange women that are thrown in there or whatever. Tamar is one of them, all right? And so part of the story is God always saving his people.
Upper story is the overarching plan of salvation that gets us eventually to Jesus.
Gets us to Jesus, exactly. And lower story, then we're going through, okay, what does it look like God's plan in Joseph? And Joseph goes through, like I said, so many ups and downs, so many twists and turns. And that's one of the places I'm really going to go in the sermon this Sunday is, okay, what does God's plan look like in the individual experience?
Right, because then it's more practical for us to see. It's probably more hopeful in the upper story. The lower story gives us more practical in the here, everyday life, because you can see how we can relate more to Joseph and his story, and how God used him in times of turmoil, in times of incredible strife, in times of betrayal, in times of emotional distress, and
it teaches us some incredible things about forgiveness, even, to sit there and see, forgiveness for the horrible wrong that's done, and reconciliation. There's an incredible story with that's very applicable to every single one of us.
Joseph is a remarkable person, because if there's anyone who could claim I'm a victim of false accusation, I'm a victim of everything else.
We hear Job whine a lot about his situation, and understandably so, but we don't really see the Joseph doing it.
He doesn't do it, and he suffered a lot. And then when he comes to, on the flip side of that, when he comes into power and when he comes into incredible authority, you also don't hear him saying, well, I've overcome so much, I've been so wise, look, I've done this, I'm so good at it. Everything in his, and the world being opposed to him, he turns to God for guidance and for wisdom and for answers. And then when he's in power and finds himself, he doesn't then forget God. He goes back to God again and says, help me to be wise, help me to be like you in forgiveness, merciful, and kind.
Because he even has that line to his brothers at the end, am I in the place of God?
Right. He's like, I cannot.
It's God's place to punish. I'm not in the place of God.
Even though from an earthly perspective,
you have the power to do that. Yeah.
Not only did he have the power, but he had the reason, the rationale, the excuse. Shoot, if my brother did that to me, I'm not sure I'd be so kind, and I'm not sure he would be so kind if I did it to him, and I wouldn't blame him.
Yeah.
At the same time, so he's got the earthly excuse, he's got the authority to carry out any punishment he wants, but he just decides, punishment for the wrongdoings of them belongs to God. His responsibility here on earth is forgiveness and mercy.
The way he sees God in every single thing.
In every part.
It really makes me think of the Job line. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Because when he gets interpretations for dreams, he basically just gives all the credit to God. He doesn't say, I understand this dream. It's God says this.
Right.
God says this is what's going to happen. And so he gives the credit to God for those good things, those incredible wisdom that he's given. But then, yeah, even for the bad things that
so
happened to him, well, God meant it.
How much humility does it take to?
Yeah.
It's almost the opposite of narcissism. I mean, it's
true.
because how much humility does it take to go through that situation and not sit there and feel sorry for yourself?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, that's humility as well. When you're being humbled, that you don't feel sorry for yourself is humility. You take yourself from the situation. But at the same time, how much humility is it then when you're brought to power and authority that you don't put yourself in that situation as well?
Yeah.
Are we doing good still? Okay. Just want to make sure everything's working. When we showed up here, there was no one in the restaurant. Now there's actually patrons here, so we're trying to be inconspicuous as possible.
Like, who are those guys in the corners?
Yeah. It closed down?
We're still live. We're still
okay.
talking.
Okay,
So yeah,
we're good. All right, very good. So, anyways, so I was just blown away, and it made me pause and think and like, man, Eric, quit feeling sorry for yourself and trust that God is still with you and God is still guiding you, and even though things aren't going how I want them to go, God's plan, overarching plan of salvation is still there, and I'm still part of that story, but also the lower story, God has not left me, and his promise is still there for me, and so to put trust in that promise.
yeah, it's an incredible amount of wisdom. I remember listening to Chad Foster. I was talking about Chad Foster.
Yeah.
One of the things, he's a
Friend of ours,
a Lutheran pastor who also is just incredibly versed in the Jewish side of the faith and
He's a
the
unique
Hebrew
person,
Bible.
I would
Yeah,
just say
it's
that.
hard to say that. But one of the things I remember him talking about with this story that actually came back to me just this moment when you're talking about his humility and wisdom is that while he doesn't practice it well in his youth or whatever, it's still there. Like the interpretation of the dreams is there. And one of the clues you get to that is that he's called a child of his father's old age, which he said is not a sign that he's the youngest child or something like that, because his brother Benjamin is actually younger than
Right,
him.
he's the
And so
second
what's being
youngest, yeah.
pointed out there is that the child of the old age is the child that has like the most wisdom around them,
Right.
has the most insight.
Old age isn't numbers.
Yes, old age is about wisdom and
Right.
insight. Like when you're wise, or when you're
It's like
older,
when
you're
somebody
wiser.
says you're older than your years.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, exactly. And so that's where they're kind of going in that. And so that's kind of a nice point to say, okay, he doesn't practice it perfectly when he's in his youth, but by the time he gets to his old age or something like that, you really see him practice wisdom throughout his life, but then especially towards the end. To be
Right.
able to have that humility to say, I'm not in the place of God. And what God has clearly brought me in the place to do is to bring forgiveness to you, to take care of our people, to take care of my father and the future generations.
So another thing, how old did you say he was when he was put into slavery, sold to the Ishmaelites?
17 years old, yeah.
And then 30.
So he's
39. You said
31, I want to say, when his brother, or when he gets elevated, or
Okay.
30 or 31 when he gets elevated
And
to the kind of position in Egypt, and then like 39 when his brothers come.
So a couple of just interesting things to think about. Okay, so imagine 17 to 39. Let's just kind of put that time frame before he had what we would call his Christian influence back in his world.
Huh.
He lived in an Egyptian
Yeah.
pagan Exodus story. So for instance, so 22 years he's living. So more than the majority of his life, he is spent in an Egyptian land worshiping false pagan gods. But yet he still has not. He's not worshiping.
He's not, but the land
But
around
the land
him is. I get
around
what
him
you're saying.
is,
Yeah.
but yet he remains faithful to the God of his youth, which is, to me, incredibly fascinating. But there's little things like, so for instance, the cup is what's known as a divination cup. Okay, it's a cup that you drink of so you can become like God. And there's
Correct.
So something that these are like Egyptian artifacts that. You also see this, by the way, in the story with Moses in Exodus, right? Moses is raised by Egyptians. And so he's got a little bit of a confusion, not a confusion, but a mix of influences,
Sure.
of the Egyptian pagan gods in there. And we in Exodus we'll be able to dive into that even more. But so it made me think, okay, we can sit there and give so much credit to the faithfulness of Joseph, but there's also a part of it that is the faithfulness of God.
Absolutely.
throughout that whole experience, God continued to reveal himself, and Joseph continued to seek out that revealing and respond to that revealing. But whether it was through the dreams or, he did what was right with Potiphar's wife, and then he had that opportunity with the cupbearer and the baker.
That if the world around us is too big, that we would be consumed by it. And there's almost a word of encouragement to us that no matter how big the pressures of the world are around you, you can stay strong. That God is faithful and will give you enough strength for whatever he places you in, whether it's a Daniel that's carried off into exile or a Moses who has to be raised up in that background.
Even to go, I think of the words in the late part of Isaiah where he says, blessed are the feet of those who bring good news, right? The whole point of that is not, it's blessed are, what people don't realize in that text is that blessed are the feet of those who bring the good news. In this pagan world where God seems to be empty and void because the temple has been destroyed, there are still just a small few remnant who are bringing the good news, and God is saying, blessed are those. And it even so as to go a step further, and Jesus, I think of when he talks to Thomas and doubting Thomas. We mentioned this not too long ago, and he said, blessed are you because you have seen, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. It is hard to be the minority of faith in a majority of a world that put our simple trust in his faithfulness. It carries us through when we are the minority. I think of, what do we do if you're a young person in high school and all your friends don't believe, and they're sitting there going to pressure you and how dumb you are or not to believe it and all that.
Or just towards behaviors that you're like, okay, I know
maybe,
this does not
maybe
fit
it doesn't
my faith.
come across in a theological way, but maybe it just comes across in how you live your life. It's real hard to stand up for what's right. For Joseph to not, he knows he could be killed, and he was thrown in jail for it, and so there's something real practical aspects that we can all glean from by watching Joseph, and then it just makes me think, what was it that he grabbed onto and held onto that kept him strong throughout all those moments? And I really believe it's just the faithfulness of God, and him being reminded and knowing the faithfulness of God and trusting in that faithfulness of God, trusting in the dreams that he had early on and knowing that what that was going to be, and saying, these dreams that I had of my brothers bowing down, not that he was looking forward to that, maybe he was, but knowing that those were all going to come to fruition.
There's a sign of some kind of hope or future.
Absolutely. There was a promise.
God's got a plan.
There was a promise of a hope and a future. And it's not too dissimilar from, we also have a promise of a hope and a future that we can lean on and grab a hold of. And so anyways, it's just some things to think about. Man, what else we got? It might be a short one.
I think there's a lot of good pieces to that. The story does go into the vast majority of the narrative. I guess one encouragement I'd have then is all these practical encouragements we've given, the best way to apprehend them is if we treat Joseph like a real person. And so it's one of those stories that, because it's so fantastic, and we've seen personified, either it's in plays or in movies or whatever, go into the story and just read it. Like, Joseph is a real person.
Read it as if you were Joseph. Exactly. How would you react in this situation?
Let him be a real person that lived in that time and place, and try to not jump ahead to knowing the end of the story, but read through that whole thing like we don't know what's happening next. We don't know. I know it's impossible not to know, but try to let it kind of unveil itself one piece at a time.
Very good. I think we're going to quit here, but again, we're at Mr. Brews, and many thanks to them.
They were very good hospitality.
It was very good.
Host,
very good hosts, and the food was great. So I would check it out. But that's where we're at. Appreciate it. God's blessings.
Yeah, blessings.